Can you discuss a little bit the separate but equal doctrine and what its effect was?
So separate but equal was an approach adopted by many states, not just in the South, but throughout the country, wherein blacks and whites would be separated into different schools, different parks, different bathrooms, different drinking fountains. But at least in theory, the facilities were equally well resourced so that there was a veneer of equality even as there was separation. As the phrase suggests, we're keeping the races separate, but we're treating them equal in the sense that blacks are kept to their own, but so too are whites, and we're giving both groups the same amount of resources.
What case established the doctrine, and what case put it to rest?
So the case that's most often associated with separate but equal is the 1890s case of Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court, with a lone dissent, ruled that it was okay under the 14th Amendment for the state of Louisiana to require blacks and whites to sit in separate railway cars. And the court in Plessy said that to the extent that the blacks feel disrespected by being in different railway cars than the whites, that's just because they choose to interpret it that way. There's nothing inherently stigmatic or disrespectful or demeaning about the idea of separation. So the dissenting justice in Plessy made arguments that later were similar to some of the arguments made by the majority in Brown versus the Board of Education, which is the case from 1954 that formally overrules Plessy, at least in part. And Justice Harlan said in his dissent in Plessy that it ignores reality to think that there's not a message of stigmatization that comes from separation. He said something to the effect of, everybody knows that the races are being kept separate to keep blacks away from whites, not the other way around. And in Brown versus the Board, the court acknowledged that and recognized that separate but equal is no longer allowed.
Can you discuss the role the NAACP played in overturning the separate but equal doctrine? For example, what means did they use? What were the major arguments they made in the Brown case?
So the NAACP is an organization that I believe was founded in the early 1900s, and their leader, who went on to become the first African-American justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, he executed a brilliant strategy of litigation, largely. The NAACP certainly did lobbying in legislatures and did PR in front of the people, but their main strategy, I think, was building an incremental lawsuit-by-lawsuit case against separate but equal that culminated in Brown versus the Board. And the big argument that Thurgood Marshall made that was successful in Brown is that even assuming that the physical facilities are equal between black schools and white schools, that to separate the blacks from the whites is to do psychological damage to them and to reinforce inferiority sentiments. And there was social science studies brought in to demonstrate that African-American kids had a lower esteem than white kids, in part because of this physical separation. So that separate is inherently unequal because of the messages that separateness sends.